Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Core MD project webinar with the title The Use of PROMs in the Evaluation of High-Risk Medical Devices. My name is Ola Rolfsson, and I've been the task leader of this task within the Core MD project. This is the 12th webinar out of a series of totally 13 webinars. To start, I would just invite you to sign up for the next webinar, which would be the last of the Core MD project, which is on 25th March at the same time as today, which is on the notified body role and the conformity assessment process. And here is a QR code you can use to sign up for the final webinar as well. So I've been interested in patient-reported outcomes since about 20 years back, and I wrote my thesis in 2010 on patient-reported outcomes using data from the Swedish Hip Arthroplasty Register. I think this is a really important topic within healthcare, and that's one of the reasons why I've been interested in engaging in the Core MD project and learn more how to use PROMs for medical device evaluation. So today's webinar, we have three speakers. It's Associate Professor John Chaplin from University of Gothenburg. We have from a European Patient Forum, Yasemin Zeisl, and from Leuven, Professor Philip Moons. We will cover different aspects of PROMs and their role in medical in the evaluation of high-risk medical devices. I would just give some housekeeping rules here, and as you understand, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available within a few days on the link you can see here on the screen. And you're all in lecture mode. That means that we welcome all interactions through the question and answers bottom. So please enter your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out to the panelists in the discussion phase at the end of the webinar. If you have any urgent technical questions, please use the chat function, and Jean-Baptiste will respond to that. And if you have further interest in the Core MD project, you may subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. And this is we are coming to the end of the Core MD project, and on March 15 there will be the final conference in Brussels. Regulatory Science for High-Risk Medical Devices, Core MD and Beyond. The main objectives of this final public event are to review the current state of implementations of the EU medical device regulation, to present all the results of the Core MD project, to consider how clinical experts should contribute to the regulatory system, and to reflect upon what developments and reforms are needed in the future. And you're all welcome to join live. You have to register using this QR code. It's on March 15 in Brussels from 10 to 4:30. There will also be a live webcast, and also for that registration is required. Would like to emphasize that Core MD is a collaboration between many centers within Europe, and it's been a very large effort, the whole Core MD project. So now for today's webinar, and I hand over to John Chaplin to talk on the core MD findings and on the utility of patient-reported outcomes. Please, John.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
It works.
Okay. Thanks very much for that introduction. My name is John Chaplin. I've been working with quality of life and patient-reported outcomes for basically all of my career, and I was very pleased to have the opportunity to work in this particular project, which is concerning medical devices and patient-reported outcome measures. And what we've done is what we were looking at is how to analyze patient-reported outcome measures in trials and studies of high-risk medical devices and cardiovascular, orthopedic, and diabetes areas, and to provide a perspective on patients on their high-risk medical devices. And the methods that we've used, we've conducted a systematic literature review, and we've surveyed the patients and caregivers' views through Delphi study and online survey and focus groups, which my colleague from the European Patients Forum will talk about after me. But I'm going to talk about the literature search. So we conducted the systematic review in the standard way, submitted the proposal for the protocol to Prospero. We followed the PRISMA protocol for systematic reviews. We looked at 3 databases, sources of data, Medline, CINAHL, and Cochrane Trials database. We searched over a period of between 2000 and 2023. We used 3 blocks of search terms, PROMs, then devices or implants, and then the condition, the cardiovascular, orthopedic, or diabetes. We included randomized control trials, observation studies. They were in English, all of the studies, and we looked for only studies that had at least a 3-month follow-up. We excluded data of studies from pharmaceuticals, rehabilitation case studies, or expert statements. We also included additional data from our colleagues who from other areas of core MD who had come across or found studies that were related to PROMs, and they kindly forwarded those to us. We also did a manual backward snowballing search of reference lists in order to make sure that we'd included as many device-related PROMs that we could that maybe hadn't turned up from our initial search. So this is what the search looked like, the PRISMA form. The screening, as you can see from the beginning, we had a vast number of studies that we were able to identify, but through the screening process, both at the abstract and the full text level, we were able to reduce this down to a reasonable number of studies that we could examine, and then we had the additional studies from our other searches and from colleagues, making in total 80 studies that we looked at in orthopedics, 50 in cardiovascular, 35 in diabetes. And I'm going to concentrate here today on the orthopedic and cardiovascular findings. This table is rather data-rich, you could say, but I want to focus just on a few things here. Firstly, to know this is the orthopedic data that we collected, and this is looking at the type of PROMs questionnaires that were being used in those studies that we examined. First thing to notice is that there are a large number of different types of PROMs that are being used. The second thing is to notice is that there are a lot more condition-specific questionnaires than there were generic PROMs. Now, we generally divide up PROMs and quality of life measurement into two different areas. One is generic, so that it applies to all medical conditions and gives a very general impression of quality of life, whereas condition-specific questionnaires are focused much more on the specific medical condition that they apply to. So here, these condition-specific measures are applicable to the orthopedic area. And they're doubled up slightly because we've also found PROMs that are related to knees and PROMs that are related to hips. And we concentrated on those two areas in order to be able to reduce the number of the vast number of studies that we could have looked at in this area. The other thing to notice on this slide is this area here on the non-validated or single items. Many single items or non-validated questionnaires come into play within the literature. Mostly this is related to pain measures. 37 questionnaires were used in the studies that we examined, but also in terms of the visual analog scales for satisfaction with outcomes. What you will also notice here is that I put in a couple of extra columns, apart from the frequency that we found the measures, also compared to pre-market assessments, which were made or which were identified in the literature review. So here you would see that the type of questionnaires or PROMs that are being used in pre-market assessment tend to be the longer versions of the questionnaires. Here we have the SF36 and the SF12, but it's the longer version of the questionnaire that tends to get used in the assessment of the devices. Here we also see the same thing, and the other column that I've included here is course sets. So recently there has been a lot of work on looking at what questionnaires could be used, minimum number of questionnaires and minimal information that should be used when collecting PROM data. And ICHOM is an example, a large example of these core sets that have been developed. And these, you will notice, will also tend to be those which are shorter in duration, shorter number of questions that are provided to the patients to answer. So there's some difference in those terms. I just wanted to highlight that there was a difference in the way of looking at these PROMs. If we then turn to the cardiovascular area, we see basically the same thing. Again, a large number of questionnaires that are being used, but there are some additional things to note here. Firstly, there are certainly more generic questionnaires that are being used than there are condition-specific. There are also a number of modified questionnaires. So one study used an Nottingham Health questionnaire and an SF36 combined questionnaire, selecting questions from those two otherwise standardized questionnaires and creating their own questionnaire for their study. So I've classified those as modified. They're not don't have the validation evidence that we would probably want to see in our usual use of PROMs questionnaires. The other modified questionnaire that I picked out here is the patient scar assessment questionnaire, which is actually an adult questionnaire, but in the studies that we looked at, one study we found they'd adapted it for children. Another thing to notice on this slide is that we did find device-specific PROMs, the Florida Patient Acceptance and Shock Anxiety scales, and implanted device adjustment scales were also used in a few of the studies that we identified. So these are specifically developed for devices, for assessing devices. The other thing to notice on this slide is that we identified in the studies that we looked at two questionnaires, the Kansas City cardiomyopathy questionnaire and the Minnesota Living with Heart Failure questionnaire, which had also been qualified by the medical development, device development tool group, I suppose, of the FDA. And by qualification, so then they mean that they have been gone through a process of approval for use with medical devices, for the assessment of medical devices. And we found several cases where they've been used. And I want to come back to the Kansas, the Minnesota, and the Florida questionnaires and examples in a moment. But I just wanted to point out that there are differences in terms of what the questionnaires, that the support that the questionnaires have received for their use. If we move on to the next slide, apart from being able to divide up what we found, the material that we found, into generic and condition specific, we can also look at primary and secondary outcomes measurement. And here we find some differences in how the questionnaires are being used. Most specifically, in primary outcomes, where PROMs are used as a primary outcome, then the condition specific tends to be used all the time. In the PROM outcomes, we also see that where primary is used, then there tends to be more quality of life of the different concepts of quality of different elements of quality of life tend to be looked at than in the secondary outcomes areas. So let me just talk about these examples before we move on to the next speaker. I've drawn some information here from the Medical Device Development Tools program, and the tools that they qualify are a number of different types of tools, but patient-reported outcomes is just one of these. And the idea with this is that qualified PROMs can be used across multiple medical device submissions and manufacturers, and the medical device sponsors can then be sure that they've got evidence that is going to be acceptable to the regulators in terms of the information that it's given. So it's suitable for utility in the tool, same context. So the first example is this tool that the KCCQ, which was originally developed in 2000. It's a 23-item questionnaire. There is also a short version of 12 questions with a 2-week recall. It's what I consider to be kind of a classic quality of life measure, divided up into different domains. Here we have symptoms, physical limitations, social limitations, quality of life as a general overview, and an overview summary scale. What is interesting to note here is that the MDDT didn't find qualification for some of the domains in this questionnaire. So domains looking at self-sufficient self-efficacy and symptom stability were not qualified for the questionnaire. What is also interesting from the documentation that they provide, that they say that the utility of the instrument is for the evaluation of safety and effectiveness, and that can be used for primary and secondary outcomes. And this is just an example of the questionnaire from the 12-item version, which shows activities and the amount of time that one is able to perform those activities. If we look just briefly at the sort of evidence that was provided in order to qualify this measure, then you see this on this left-hand side is the domains, and then the type of validity that has been used in order to confirm the qualification of these measures, so convergent and divergent validity. And what you may also notice is that the SF-36 physical and social scales, general health scales appear here. So it's compared to a standardized questionnaire, which is kind of like the SF-36 is kind of like the gold standard questionnaire in quality of life research. The second example is the Minnesota heart failure questionnaire. Here, this is 21. This is an older questionnaire dated from the 80s. And it's different structure, different type, which is also what I wanted to illustrate in terms of utility. It has 21 adverse events listed, which the patient then reports on over a 4-week period on a 6-point scale. So the question is, did your heart failure prevent you from living in the way you wanted during the past month? And then a series of different adverse events which may have prevented that. Again, the utility is for the evaluation of safety and efficacy and effectiveness. And the evidence that they provided for the qualification of this questionnaire is based on internal, external reliability, so test, retest reliability, conversion, diversion, and predictive validity. So a substantial amount of evidence is produced in order to be able to qualify these questionnaires, which can then be used for a number of different devices. The third example, last example that I want to give is of the Florida Patient Acceptance Survey. This is a more recent questionnaire, 2005. It has 15 items. There again are 4 factors, and the factor analysis was conducted as a more modern instrument that is constructed on the basis of psychometric properties. It also has convergent validity with the SF-36, and these 4 factors, so return to function, device-related distress, positive appraisal, and body image concerns. And this was the only questionnaire that we found in the data that we looked at that was also looking for information about body image or appearance issues that might emerge. One thing that I also wanted just to briefly mention is other aspects that related to utility. So there are different ways of identifying important change, and this is something that needs to be considered very seriously when we're choosing a questionnaire. In these examples that I've given here, so sometimes for pain, for example, a 20-point difference or a 30% difference is given as an indication of acceptable or significant change. Minimum clinical important difference values have also been published for a number of the questionnaires, including the Oxford Knee Society questionnaire, for example, and also for the SF-36. Most of the studies that we looked at in the literature review used a statistical significance on a basis of a 0.05 level in order to indicate that there was a difference between the elements of the devices or the populations that were being looked at. And the Florida Patient Questionnaire used a cutoff of 67, so they found evidence of a cutoff that they could use. The other point on this slide is, when do you do a follow-up? And this is a critical issue in terms of the resources as well that need to be used for PROM measurement. Mostly what we found is that the measurement of PROMs, or the use of PROMs, is coincided with other data collection, clinical data collection. So it's often recommended in order to reduce the resources needed for clinical trials that all data should be collected at the same time. So PROMs are used at the same time as other clinical measures are being taken. This might not actually be ideal for measurement of patient-reported outcomes, but that is something which is still not clear from the literature, exactly when should we follow up. But we found follow-up stages from 6 weeks to 5-10 years in the data that we looked at. So how are we going to use PROMs in regulatory decision making? Well, PROMs, as we've seen here, contribute to our understanding of the real world effects in terms of satisfaction or acceptance, and those questionnaires which I showed you, the KCCQ and the Florida questionnaire, are examples of that. PROMs were also used to identify adverse events, and this is also another way in which we can find utility for PROMs. We can also use PROMs in order to be able to obtain data that's outside of the normal clinical visits. through questionnaires or more recently through electronic presentation of PROMs. And they can be used for intermediate or secondary or intermediate endpoints, which may be useful for a study. In addition to that, then PROMs can also be seen to have utility in the selection of clinical study subjects, or to stratify the patient population and by predicting risk. Study population enrichment, which might be important, defining adverse events and developing post-market surveillance methodologies. There are, however, a number of challenges that need to be considered. There are budget and time challenges. The collection of patient-reported outcomes poses some process barriers, such as protocol implementation and site training. There is not always so good availability of interpretation guidelines of the results. And often in the studies that we looked at, it's simple score is given with no real interpretation of what the score is related to or how we can interpret that. There is a lack of psychometric evidence for some of those studies. Some of them have remarkable amount of evidence, but others have very little. From the stakeholders' point of view, then there often seems to be a lack of clarity on the evidence that's required, what and how much evidence is necessary, and priorities for PROM evidence generation, which needs to be looked at if we're going to use PROMs in the future in this area. This is my final slide, so I just wanted to highlight that there are a lot of sources of information on patient-reported outcomes, how to develop patient-reported outcomes, how to use patient-reported outcomes in medical device development, both from the European Medical Agency, from the FDA, and from scientific associations which have been working in this area for a long time. And with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thanks for sending in questions. I think we could do a couple of quick clarification questions, John. One is when you say pre-market assessment, what do you refer to then?
What I was referring to actually was I was looking at the FDA assessment for pre-market use of the instruments and in the medical devices, and these were the questionnaires that were being used, were being recommended. So those were the questionnaires that were used. They weren't necessarily qualified by the MDDT, but they were still being used as evidence for the devices. Okay, thank you. And talking about core outcome set, is that a core outcome set or core outcome measurement set? What do you refer to that? Well, here I was thinking both of there have been some core sets of questionnaires that have been developed. Principally, if I was thinking about ICHOM initiative, which has been developing a set of questionnaires that could be used for the measurement of in different conditions. And what would be the minimal information that was needed? What would be the type of PROMs that could be used across the board by the majority a number of people? So often they're looking for questionnaires which were license-free, that could be used by everybody, that would be easy to interpret, and as short and less burden to the patient as possible. So that's what I was referring to. Okay, so like a combination of different already available PROMs. Yeah. Along with other items. Yeah. All right. Thank you, John. Now we will hear more about the patient perspective in the evaluation of medical devices. And Yasemin Zeisl from the European Patient Forum. Please, Yasemin.
Good. All right. So good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasemin Zeisl.
and I'm a project coordinator at the European Patients Forum. EPF is an umbrella patient organization focusing on chronic diseases, and we have 79 members across Europe. And today I'll talk about the research we have done on patient perspectives, on the role of PROMs in the evaluation of medical devices as part of the CoreMD project, and we did that together with John. So to find out more about what patients think about medical devices and PROMs, we did a Delphi study. And for those who are not familiar with the Delphi method, it's a method that aims to build consensus among different participants through several rounds of consultation. They are done in a consecutive way. And to do that, we recruited 22 patients and carers of patients. They were parents with diabetes, cardiovascular, and orthopedic conditions. We had three main goals that you can see here on the slides. First of all, of course, doing patient-centric research, so finding out what patients really think about themselves, having a medical device, how their experience is with that device, and what they think and know about PROMs. Then, of course, building consensus among the group of participants on the use and utility of PROMs, and finally, complementing the literature review that John just presented about. So how did we go about this? As mentioned before, we had several rounds of questionings for, in total, 2 online surveys and 2 online focus groups. We started in October 2023, and it lasted for several months, and we finished around mid-end of January 2024. The online surveys, both of them were taken by all participants. And the focus groups, for that, we divided the whole cohort of participants in 2 smaller subgroups of about equal size. And the first group participated in the first focus group, and there we really explored topics and issues that were raised in the online surveys. And with the second focus group, we then validated key findings from the first focus group. And the last few weeks we've been spending analyzing and drafting the report on these findings. So now to the more interesting part. Here you can see a ranking of important areas that patients think are important to them when it comes to their experiences with medical devices. We had a ranking of the top 10. Number 1 is the most important, and number 10 is less important, but still important. So as you can see from the first 3 items on the list, safety is a key concern for patients. Number 1, safety and performance of the device, but then also number 2, concerns about the misfunctioning of a device. And number 3, feeling a sense of security with the device. Also important is having control of the device as a patient, so feeling that you know what the device does, how it works, and how to use it on the everyday basis. Of course, then comfort, thinking that patients live with devices every single day. It should feel comfortable, and ideally you wouldn't feel it at all, or you would have very little pain when wearing the device. Less important, but still very important, is the replacement of the device. So for instance, some devices have to be exchanged every few years through a surgery, and that's a lot of effort, of course, and maybe a source of stress for patients. So having a device that lasts longer and is more robust is, of course, very important to patients. Then moving on to number 7, noise and size. So size also relates a bit to the comfort aspects. It shouldn't be too bulky or too big. And also in terms of the noise, that has an impact on the quality of life of patients. For instance, if it makes a continuous noise, or even alarms that go off in the middle of the night, that can impact the quality of sleep. Or even social events, for instance, going to the cinema and an alarm goes off, that can be embarrassing for some people and not really make your life more easy or comfortable, let's say. And the last 3 points are related to the visual aspects of the device. So shape, appearance, and color. Those are less important based on what participants agreed on. Maybe a side note is that there were 2 participants who noted that as a young person, you would perhaps care more about the visual design. And this, then one person specifically said this changed when they got older. They cared more about safety and functions. So this is not a clear finding where we gather common consensus, of course, but it's maybe an interesting side note that could be explored further in the future. So here we have some other key findings on the use of PROMs, and maybe the most important thing to know from our research is that, and perhaps also shocking, is that patients don't really know what PROMs are. Some patients said that they may have participated in one, but they couldn't tell because they didn't know if it was one or not. But in general, patients agreed that they wanted to share feedback, wanted to be involved in the design of devices, but at the same time, it wasn't quite clear to them how to share their feedback and their experiences with manufacturers. And do they contact them, or do they tell their doctor? And does the doctor then forward that information to the right people? So in that sense, PROMs have the potential to really help systematically collect patient feedback on medical devices and lived experiences of patients. In terms of the frequency of PROM use, respondents preferred intervals of 3 to 6 months. So that means about 2 to 4 times a year participating in a PROM. And the idea here is that patients contribute over a longer period of time to really get good feedback and also see changes over time. But there's a risk of a high dropout rates. If patients lose interest, well, that's not great. So patients themselves also should see why it is important for them to participate, to get more information about the PROM, what it is about, but also maybe learn about the results of the PROM from their healthcare professional, and see why it's also relevant to their own treatment and to the medical device that they have, to keep them motivated to participate. Finally, the detail and format of PROM questionnaires. We had different opinions about what would be most convenient, either online or printed, or at the clinic or at home. So it really depends on the individual person. Some prefer to sit at home and think about the questions. Some prefer to do it at the clinic right when they do a checkup. Moving on to patient information, it was extremely important to patients to feel in control of their devices, in a way, to have a say about what device they get, because, of course, this is a big decision in a patient's life and in their treatment. So having more than one option is something that they strongly advocated for. And in order to make a choice between different devices available to them, patients also need, of course, information about those devices and what their functions are, and pros and cons about different options. So that leads me to the second point, the desired information and learning materials for patients before getting a device and also after getting a device to get to know it better. Here, patients preferred a combination of different materials and formats. So those could be, for instance, instruction manuals online or on paper, online websites, trainings in person with professionals, or leaflets that are on paper printed out at the doctor's office. So all sorts of options are possible and liked by patients. But what was highlighted was having visual information, especially videos. There may be promotional videos out there about medical devices, but patients really would like to have more explanatory videos that show how a device is being used, answer questions that they may have, etc. In terms of the volume of information, well, the results show that patients want enough information to make an informed decision, but of course, at the same time, not be overwhelmed by too much, especially information with very technical language. And finally, as you can imagine, we live in 2024, and when somebody has a question, they often go online. Same applies to patients. They go online and on social media, online forums, to ask questions about devices that they are considering or that they already have. And that really gives them the opportunity to ask peers, other patients, about their specific experience. That could also be a way to ask questions that they may not feel comfortable asking their healthcare provider. And so while that is a good way to share and exchange information for patients, at the same time, we also need to be cautious. We're talking about healthcare and health and safety information. So it was agreed in focus groups that moderation from, for instance, a patient organization or a healthcare professional would be good to keep the information accurate and safe for the group members. So as we've seen, the use of PROMs provides a standardized way of collecting information about patients' lived experience with devices, and patient-reported data can consistently give information to healthcare providers, patients, caregivers, and also device manufacturers, and that can feed into the device design and also improve designs. But what is important is that PROMs should be implemented more systematically, and their usability and usefulness must be more enhanced to fulfill their true potential. And based on this, we developed 5 core recommendations for further patient involvement. So the first one would be develop a set of core indicators for PROMs per disease area that addresses patients' concerns and captures information that is relevant from their own perspective. So as we've seen the ranking before, and that would then inform healthcare decisions and further research and development, innovation of devices. Number 2, clearly communicate the objectives of PROM collection, inform patients about the use of their feedback, and also share results and updates with them. So keeping patients informed, but also in that way, keeping them engaged in continuously sharing their thoughts and experiences in PROMs. Then number 3, facilitate PROM collection to ensure patients' engagement and willingness to contribute. So that refers to the frequency and format that patients would prefer or that would be useful from patients' perspectives. Number 4, develop ways to integrate PROMs and patient experience data more generally in the regulatory process for medical devices and also for the assessment of the risk and benefit of medical devices. And finally, involve patients throughout the life cycle of medical devices, including not only in the development of devices themselves, but also in the information and communication materials that are shared with patients and also specifically address their needs and concerns and questions. So that is all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there is a quick follow-up question here about the number 1 priority of patients' safety and performance. And I think the question here is about what is performance?
Yeah, so it's about a device working well, having not any misfunctionings. It's really about the device working as intended from a safety perspective.
Okay, and could that be captured by PROMs or?
Well, it would be how safe does a patient feel with a device. Of course, there's other evaluations on the safety of devices, but the PROM would really help with understanding what patients feel about that. I mean, it's great if a device is safe. But if patients don't feel that way, also thinking more about AI in the future, then, well, that's a problem.
Okay, thank you, Yasemin. Now I'll hand over to Philip Moons, who will talk on cardiology, and this is a work Philip has done with co-workers at the European Society of Cardiology. So please, Philip.
Thank you, Olaf, for the introduction. Happy to be here. Indeed, I'd like to address the work that has been done under the umbrella of the European Society of Cardiology. It kind of coincided with the CORE-MD project, but to a certain extent, it nicely follows up on what Yasmina and John have said before. So what is actually the key document that resulted from this endeavor? It is a statement. It's a statement from different ESC organizations, associations, councils, working groups, and so on. And if you want to have the details of what I'm saying today, please scan this QR code and have a look at the paper or download the paper itself. This is the graphical abstract of this paper, and I would like to guide you through this abstract because these were kind of the highlights of the work that this task force has done. It won't surprise you that the kind of the starting point of the work is that quite often as clinicians, we focus on clinical outcomes, but the price to pay is that there is little room given for the voice of the patient. And if we really want to come to an ideal improvement of the care, then we should not only take clinical outcomes, we also should not take only patient-reported outcomes, but it's the combination of the two that really gives us the best information that helps us in our decision-making, in proposing the best treatments for the patients. Of course, when talking about patient-reported outcomes, it is not self-evident that we all know what we are talking about. And that is also something that we gave enough room in this scientific statement to make sure that we had a good definition of patient-reported outcomes and that we also could specify what are domains that belong under that umbrella term of patient-reported outcomes. And you see them summarized here. We are talking about symptoms. We are talking about functionality, functional status, but not only in physical terms, but also in psychological and in social terms. Health-related quality of life, the overall quality of life. Behaviors do belong under the umbrella of patient-reported outcomes as well. And what may be surprising for some people is that the experiences with care, which are measured with not with PROMs, not with patient-reported outcome measures, but with patient-reported experience measures, these experiences with care belong to the patient-reported outcomes as well. So to a certain extent, it helps us to structure what we are talking about. What are the things where you can use patient-reported outcomes for? It is clear, and Yasemin also referred to that. When you ask patients to complete forms, to complete patient-reported outcome forms, they want to make sure that something is happening with it, that the data, that the information is discussed with the patient. And that is really something where shared decision-making can be built upon. So one of the domains where patient-reported outcomes play a role is in clinical care. It's in shared decision-making. Patient-reported outcomes can also be used in quality monitoring and improvement. We know the national or regional registries where it is kind of investigated or monitored what the quality in the different centers is. And it's not to judge people as such, but it's rather to see where is there room for improvement and to make people thinking of their own practices. There is an increasing use of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials because also there PROs do have a place as sometimes a primary or a secondary outcome, as we heard from John earlier tonight. Something where it really becomes important for the core MD project is regulatory affairs. Their PROMs or PROs do have a place. A bit related to that in reimbursement decisions, and finally digital health. And let's be honest, what we have seen happening with artificial intelligence, this is only the beginning. So digital health will increase in the upcoming years. What is the place for patient-reported outcomes? It clearly has a place there, but we need to define that further. There are different instruments, as was clear from John's presentation. We also recognized in the statement that there are generic questionnaires and there are disease-specific questionnaires, and there are also domain-specific questionnaires. We took a slightly different approach than what John has done, clearly because the aims were different. Overall, we identified 102 disease-specific patient-reported outcomes. Disease-specific being a multidimensional or a domain-specific instrument. When you go through this list, it was striking to me that there are little instruments that are specifically designed for the use in devices. There is one instrument, Valiosa. This is developed to measure the satisfaction with remote cardiac monitoring. So implantable device that is measured from, that is assessed and monitored from a distance. And what do patients think about it? How are their experiences with this kind of cardiac monitoring? That is actually one instrument that was found in this approach. Two other instruments have to do with LVADs, the left ventricular assist devices. One is the LVAD stressor scale, and the other is the quality of life with a ventricular assistive device questionnaire. The Florida scales that John referred to didn't pop up in the search, didn't pop up in the approach that was used here. So clearly the two searches, the two projects are complementary in a certain way. And to be honest, this is all. So out of the 102 instruments, these were the only instruments that could specifically refer to devices. Of course, it does not mean that the other instruments are not relevant or not useful. When you have a device, when you have a treatment that is aiming to reduce symptoms, well, then it's clear that a multidimensional symptom questionnaire made for the specific population that you focus on, such a symptom questionnaire could be useful, even if it doesn't have anything to do with the device. But you want to improve the symptoms, so that is important. Same with other phenomenon that you want to improve by implanting the device. So I clearly want to recommend all of you to have a look at this list and see, are there certain questionnaires, certain patient-reported outcomes questionnaire that could be helpful. For sure, and this was touched upon by John as well, not every questionnaire is as valuable. There are questionnaires that are well investigated, well supported, and there is a strong empirical underpinning of these questionnaires. So it's obvious that you can rely more on such questionnaires than on questionnaires that have been used in 1 or 2 studies. On the other hand, we also need to bear in mind that the questionnaire marketing plays a role as well. It can be a business model for some people to make sure that a lot noise is given to a certain questionnaire, not necessarily because it is better than a competitor or a competing questionnaire, but just because they have a marketing behind them. So we need to bear in mind that there is a kind of business model behind some of the questionnaires that you will find as well. What was important for the task force when writing this statement was we don't want to limit ourselves to say, okay, this is what we can do now, but we also want to guide future developments. And all these developments in the different domains where PROMs can be used are included in this box. And once again, let me focus on the regulatory purposes. What are things that the task force thought was important was that minimal requirements for PROM suitability for regulatory purposes should be developed. And this is very much in line with what CORE-MD is all about. Minimal clinically important differences should be determined for all the PROMs that are used for regulatory purposes. And that is a challenging thing. When you look at the minimal clinically important difference in most studies, and I have to plead guilty, I did this as well, most of the time a distribution-based method is used. You look at how many standard deviation of a difference do play a role. Actually, when you listen to patients, then you only get the real answer on what is clinically important. It's not because 2 standard deviations difference that this also means that for a patient, this is enough of a change to have an implantation of a certain device. So I clearly want to plea here that we need to build more structures where we can bring in the voices of patients and listen to what is clinically important from their perspective. Existing EU guidance on the clinical evaluation of medical devices and the recommendations from the international standardization organizations. Also, this is important. Although it is mainly about regulatory purposes, like I said, slightly related to that is the reimbursement and the health economics purpose. So I would like to close with this. The recommendations that the task force has given here is the use of a broad range of patient-reported outcomes should be further evaluated in this respect. Consensus has to be reached among patients, clinicians, and decision makers on choosing the appropriate PROMs for reimbursement and health economic purposes. Reimbursements, of course, need to be based on a risk adjustment, because otherwise you tend to focus on those patients who are doing well and have a good patient-reported outcome, and leave the patients that really need more care and more complex care, we face the risk that they are abandoned. Health technology assessment should consider both generic and disease-specific instruments to have good comparison of conditions. And finally, the international consensus on adequate data gathering methods ought to be reached, because of course in eras of GDPR, how can we share data? How can we make sure that those who could benefit from having this information, how can they have access to the data? So once again, this was a snapshot of the statement that was made for the European Society of Cardiology. Again, I recommend you to have a look at this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philip. Very nice presentation. We have gotten a lot of questions, and since John have been active trying to respond to them as well. But I think there are some interesting ones that we could discuss now for the last 10 minutes of this webinar. And there's one question: have we got the PROMs we need, or do we need to develop some better ones, particularly for implants? What is your take on that, Philip?
It's probably a very nuanced answer. I think we need more PROMs, because I'm sure that certain phenomena, certain aspects of whatever treatment, including implants, are not touched upon, or not addressed, fully addressed and sensitively addressed by all existing instruments. On the other hand, I also want to avoid that we end up in a situation where we are developing instruments because of the instrument development, and it becomes a kind of a hobby for some people. No one is benefiting from that either. So it's yes to certain, but we need to be very careful in what we want to choose. And we definitely need to avoid that we are making 10 more instruments for measuring phenomena where there is already a PROM available.
John, what do you say on this question?
Yeah, I agree with Philip. I think that there is a need in this particular area to develop more PROMs, which I think it's lacking in this particular area. I'm surprised there weren't more instruments that have been designed specifically for that, for the purpose of looking at medical devices. But I also agree with Philip that we see constantly new questionnaires being developed and published, and it is a bit of a shame that we produce so much of this sort of material that is then never used. Quite a lot of the questionnaires that are developed and go through long processes of validation then remain on the shelf. So I think that's also something that we need to look at from the scientific viewpoint, just whether we're producing the sort of information that we need. But I think the fact that we do produce so many new instruments is an indication that people feel that the instruments that are available at the moment lack something. They're not exactly measuring the thing that they want to measure. And I think we need to take that into consideration, and also that when we're looking at, we say, just take it off the shelf and there's already a measure on quality of life. But we need to be careful that that measure of quality of life measures the domains that we're actually interested in, because quality of life can be many different things. And a lot of questionnaires include different aspects of quality of life, different domains. And so we need to be conscious of that as well. So
isn't one problem here that PROMs have not really been used, that we haven't learned how to use PROMs in how to evaluate medical devices. I mean, we use them to evaluate an intervention or a treatment, but not really comparing different devices. Isn't that one of the problems? I mean, there's so many studies in this within different areas, but not really comparing different devices. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I agree. On the other hand, I'm quite optimistic in that respect as well. If you see how little PROMs are used in clinical care, but things are changing, and certain medical disciplines are taking the lead. If you see what is happening in oncology, in orthopedics, in rheumatology, there are other disciplines like cardiology that can learn from the experiences, and I think that is a kind of a nail we constantly need to hit to make sure that people understand that this is an extremely important voice that is underused and did not get the attention that it deserves.
Another question here is about the timing and how should we decide how long follow-up is needed for specific medical devices when it comes to evaluation with patient-reported outcome measures. John, what do you say?
Yeah, I think this is a question which we haven't asked scientifically as yet. I mean, I think the way that we collect PROM data tends to be guided by the requirements of clinical measures, so that we measure out certain time points that are relevant to other issues than PROMs. And we don't really have any kind of proper idea, I don't think at the moment, what would be an appropriate time point for PROM measurement, for quality of life measurement. What is that, a year, or is that 6 months that we expect to see some sort of change? Initial change may be sufficient to tell us that we've had some effect on the patient's lives, but maybe a long-term effect, maybe we could also expect to see if we've made substantial changes in the patient's health. I don't think we really know what we should do there, but I think that we need to be prepared that we should be able to separate the collection of data from PROMs from clinical assessment. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the same time.
And Yasemin, what came up in the Delphi procedure on the length of follow-up from patient perspective?
So for the length, I mean, we didn't have any conclusive information, but overall it makes sense that a questionnaire shouldn't be too long, especially since we're talking also about survey fatigue. If it's very long and if it's very often, then the risk of a high dropout rate is, of course, higher. So yeah, therefore it's important to focus on a core outcome set to ask the really important questions.
If I can follow up on this, I think it all depends on what you expect in terms of effectiveness of the device. If this is a device that should have an instantaneous effect, then of course the frequency of follow-up in the beginning should be very short, and you have to have a frequent assessment. If it is about an improvement over months, then of course you can be more relaxed in your timing. When it comes to continuous monitoring of a device, I would say as long as the device is there. I mean, whenever a patient comes to a doctor visit, we take the blood pressure. Why not taking other assessments that gives a good view on the status of the patient? So that would be my take on this.
Okay,
maybe
yes.
to add here, a little example from the study is that I think a diabetes patient reported that when they first got the device, of course, safety was really important to them and the functions. But over time, as they got used to the device, then their attention shifted towards other things, maybe more lifestyle related aspects that were really important to them, because safety at that point was a given. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question here, and it relates to the FDA work that you were mentioning, John, and where they use the SF-36 as the gold standard questionnaire. And then the question was, why don't all trials just use the SF-36?
Yeah, well, of course, a lot of studies do use the SF-36. It's probably the most commonly used questionnaire, and it has been around for a long time, and it is used all over the world and been translated and validated everywhere. So it's got a tremendous scientific support for the use of that. But people don't use it because often people think that 36 questions is too much for a patient to fill out, so they would rather have something that's short. And there is now an SF-12, which is the shorter version, but it doesn't have the maybe the sensitivity that the 36 version has. So it's still, as I was trying to show from health authorities' perspective, it's still the 36, which is the gold standard that you compare other questionnaires to. People may feel that the SF-36 doesn't cover all of the issues that they would like to cover, and it doesn't cover the condition-specific issues, which may be more relevant to some patient areas. Apart from that, yeah, I mean, it does get used a lot. It's sort of a little bit old now, and maybe it could be new questionnaires might be more appropriate, might be more worded in a different way that could be more useful. It is a fixed questionnaire, so it's 36 questions. You've got to use all the questions, whereas there are systems nowadays such as the PROMs initiative and other item banking systems which allow you to more mix different numbers of questions and still arrive at the same measurement. That is something that you can't do with the SF-36. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's a good questionnaire. Yeah.
Philip, do you have any final remarks on that question?
Yeah, I agree with John. What I want to stress in what he said was, you need to see, or you need to make sure that you know what you're looking after. And such a generic, and to be honest, I would not be a fan for having one instrument being the SF-36 or something else, but having the standard of one instrument. It all depends on what you look for. Imagine that you have a device for the treatment of tinnitus. Well, you will not capture any dimension of tinnitus with SF-36. So why would that be the standard then? So I really want to plea for researchers, make sure that you capture what you want to improve with your device, or with your treatment, or with whatever. Otherwise, you're bound to have a negative trial for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good final remark, I think. And I would like to thank the audience for participating in this webinar, and please register for the final conference of the Core MD. And thanks to all the participants in this panel as well. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Good evening.